Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Phil Dobbie. Phil is a. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Phil Dobbie. Phil Dobbie is the podcaster, radio broadcaster, writer? Yeah. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Phil Dobbie. Phil is a podcaster and oh man, I suck. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Phil Dobbie. Phil is a podcaster and radio Welcome back to Steve and Friends. This week we have a special guest, Phil Dobbie. Phil is a world-renowned podcaster and radio broadcaster. He also shares a birthday with Donald Trump. Maybe you can help me do these video intros. Welcome back to Steve and Friends. It's February 11th, 2023. We have a special guest this week, Phil Dobbie. Maybe he can help me on my broadcasting skills. I'll do some housekeeping as people roll into the chat, which you can see right here. We added this feature last week and it was quite successful. Being Super Bowl weekend, I don't know how many people are going to show up. So if you are one of the few people this weekend, make sure you start spamming the hell out of that. I don't mind, as long as it's not derogatory. Say what you want to say. Make sure you hit the like button. Subscribe. We're on the Professor Steve Keen channel on YouTube. We're also on Twitter right now. So if you're watching from Twitter, retweet and like, and then jump over onto YouTube. If you have an account on YouTube, you can sign in and join the chat. We have a poll going on right now on Professor Steve Keen's Twitter. And so if you want to actually go on there and answer the poll, so have a guess. Were Henry Ford or Thomas Edison opposed to fiat money? Maybe we can squeeze some answers out of Steve on what he meant by this question. Maybe we're going to have to wait until the poll's over. But nonetheless, if you have a Twitter account, go check that out, vote, but make sure you don't leave here. Some other housekeeping. I put out a tweet last week that caused a little bit of controversy, and I apologize to my MMT friends. My attempt was to show just the mechanics of fiat money and how it comes into play. And what I do myself, this comes from a modeling perspective as I separate the central bank and the government. And I made a provocative tweet, which that's what you do on social media. You try to be provocative and get some attention. I did that. I got some attention, and it was somewhat negative. In my tweet, I said that government spending is financed by bonds, deficit spending always. And that was to be provocative, and it wasn't necessarily meant to say that government deficit spending doesn't indeed kind of start in the first instance and then reserves are created. I kind of laid that out in the tweet, but it was taken completely the wrong way. Some positive news came out of it. I met two people on Twitter, and we now follow each other, that I find really fascinating. I'll bring up their books because I think it might be important. From Dirk Entz and Brian Romachuk. I talked to them both. Of course, they both jumped on once Warren Mosler came in and corrected me on my vernacular. but later they read the entire tweet where I showed all the balance sheets, and they understood my perspective. Anyways, they have a lot of great insights on the separation or consolidation of the central bank and treasury. So in MMT, that's what they do, and that's fine. From an aggregate perspective, it works really well. Just for me, being a system dynamicist and seeing the relationship between every agent, I often separate those two. What else do we have going on here? I think we can just bring on Steve first, and because we didn't have him last week, so I'll bring him on. Steve, how you doing, buddy?
Very well. Yeah, I watched that controversy rather amusedly.
I think my biggest mistake was actually trying to fight back. The MMT community is very powerful. So
yeah, it's another version of what is it called, UFC? It ends up being a bit of a brawl. Yeah. I mean, what I pointed out to some people was that what you're doing is saying who presses the buttons effectively. When money gets entered into deposit accounts at the private banks, whose employee is touching the buttons? And the answer was one of the private banks, not the central bank. And then when the transfers are made from treasury account to reserves, who's pressing the button? Somebody at the central bank, et cetera, et cetera. So, but the overall dynamics, the money is created by government fiat, which
which in a long way in my chain of tweets, that's what I was trying. In fact, my last page on my tweet, I made it quite clear that all my chain of events support stabs. And for anybody listening to the show, there is two theories: that you have the stab theory or the tab theories. The stab theory is spending before taxes and bonds, as opposed to the tabs theory, which is taxes and bonds before spending. Oh, these acronyms. Boy, oh boy.
Yeah.
Let's bring on Dan, and then we'll bring on Phil. Dan, how you doing?
Really good. Thanks for having me again as the co-host.
I love having you, Dan. We did so well last week, just being on our own because of the technical difficulties. We have people in the chat again. Send those questions in. Chat amongst yourselves. Hit the like button. We love it. We love having you here. I'm going to bring on the man himself, the world renowned broadcaster and podcaster, Phil Dobbie.
Can I just say I feel as though I'm being oversold here. It would be my opening remarks. So that whole thing about under promise and over deliver. I feel like you've set me up the wrong way. So
if you have watched wrestling in the mid 1990s, you'd get advertised this pay-per-view event weeks and weeks in advance with all these big matches, and you would spend your $30 or 30 pounds, depending on what part of the world you're in, and you would be massively underwhelmed. But the fun part really was the build-up, right? And then acknowledging after the fact that life really isn't that exciting sometimes.
So what you're saying is you want me in spandex? Is that what you're saying? You want me in the wrestling gear? maybe that would be good for the audience, or maybe not.
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. I suspect. Yeah. So look, I'm curious. I've not obviously not done this before, and actually never done a live stream before like this either. So I've done live streams as in live radio shows and stuff, but this is interesting. So I'm intrigued. So, and it's we'll see how it goes.
All right. Well, let's get this out of the way, because there is a connection between you and Steve with the Debunking Economics podcast. Phil, tell me how that all started. I guess that was around 5 years ago.
Oh, but no
Oh,
more than
no.
that, wasn't it, Steve? Yeah, I don't know, like 10 years ago. How long have we known each other for? So I was, so my career has been a mix of, so I started in media when I was about 16 years old. I didn't know Steve then, but I was, when I was 16, Steve would still have been old, of course, at that stage. But because he's always old. Have you ever been young, Steve?
Very funny. Never younger than you.
So, but yeah, radio was my passion when I was younger, and I started working in radio when I came out of college, so I was 21. But then I spent and then I went to Australia, and I was on the radio in Australia. But most of my life there was actually in boring marketing jobs in telecommunications, and then I went through one too many corporate takeovers where, if you're the marketing guy in a company that gets taken over, then the guy who's marketing for the company that's being bought out obviously loses his job, and the marketing guy or girl at the company doing the acquisition obviously stays on. So I was acquired too many times and lost a job, and so I just thought I need to get back to what I would enjoy. So I got back into media and started doing some podcasts before they were fashionable for CBS Interactive, who'd set up a business site called BNet, which is now part of CBS Money Watch, and I did a daily podcast then, and Steve came on that a few times. I just came across him, and he gave an interesting perspective. So that's when we first met, wasn't it? Then I think we tried to do something with a mad Mexican.
I don't know that he's Mexican. Definitely mad. He might be Mexican. We don't want to mention Gonzalo Lira's name here, though, so I won't mention.
Okay,
Gonzalo
that's right. Well, I was trying not to. Yeah. So that was, and then 6
and I
years
won't say
ago,
that Gonzalo Lira's an asshole either. That'd be really rude to do it in public.
No, you don't want to do that.
So I won't say that he's an asshole. Yeah.
So then so 6 years ago we thought, well, okay, let's just do a podcast for Debunking Economics. We'll put it behind the sort of the paywall under Patreon, because Steve was getting the Patreon site up and going, and we thought that would be another thing we could throw in for Patreon supporters. And so we did that, and then we've done 310 episodes or something so far. We talked about everything 4 times at least, and it's been an interesting journey, because even Steve has actually changed your opinion on some things over that 4 years, haven't you? I mean, not much, but
well, I didn't like your tie initially. Now I like your tie.
Things thoughts evolve, and it's been an interesting experience for me, because it's not I'm, as well as doing that, I say radio. I don't do a lot of radio these days, because radio sort of is really a dying industry, and particularly since COVID, there's just not many freelance gigs, so I'm not doing a lot of that now. But I do. My main money actually comes from working for the dark side, doing a finance podcast for a bank. So the National Australia Bank in Australia, I do a podcast every day called The Morning Call, which is just about movements in the market, what's driving market changes. And so it's interesting talking to people there and their views on what's driving the markets, and talking to Steve. Sometimes, you'd imagine they'd be radically different, but it's interesting. There's some people there who, particularly I think since the last couple of years, entertain the idea that perhaps there's a different way of looking at things. And and people in dealing in the money markets, they don't care about the theory; they just want to know what the outcome is. So they'll entertain any theory, I think, actually, in reality.
I have a question for you, Phil. I mean, I've listened to your show with Steve, I would say probably a dozen times. I mean, I'm a fan. I think it's hard to tune in every episode, but I like the exchange. And one of the things I would characterize the exchange between you and Steve with is sometimes it can almost sound like you're antagonistic, and let's use a few words to describe that, but there's an intensity in your voice sometimes, and your style, it can be quick and throwing things in front of Steve. And then there's an interesting dynamic that I would describe in the podcast. And I don't know if that's my small sample size. I mean, like you said, you've had the opportunity to do this with him over a decade. So, and I do relate with the idea of we've covered everything and then some, and then some, and then some, and over again and over again and over again, right? Like
different angles each time.
Yeah, you bring it up and you rehash those. But yeah, could you maybe tell the audience a little bit about the dynamic and how you interact with Steve on the show, on the podcast?
Well, I mean, you know, I think we're good mates, aren't we, Steve? Really, you know, we're
good mates. We're good mates.
So that helps, and because we have known each
other on that particular front, by the way, when
we haven't slept together or anything, but
no, we haven't slept together. Well, you know, you've got to lose a bit more weight before I'm interested, mate. You know, maybe redistribute the weight. That's probably more the point. But when I was hearing your stuff, and I was quite enjoying, you know, your own podcast when you were doing your thing in Australia before we got together through Lyra trying and failing dismally to start a successful broadcast business with the pair of us. But I was looking forward to interacting with you because you were doing a lot of stuff on telecommunications. And like I'd worked in the computing industry as well. So I agreed with your insights in telecommunications and stuff like that too. So I knew you're not just someone who's a voice. You know, you've got a knowledge perspective as well from all the years of telecommunications.
Gee, I like coming on this. This is. I mean, I come on. Everyone says nice things about me. That hardly ever happens. You know, shall we do this every week from now on? So no, that was interesting. That was a podcast, and that went down quite well actually. I did as well as that daily business podcast. I did a weekly. Because I worked in the telco space, I did a weekly podcast on the telecommunications industry, and I'm just trying to fit into the window here. You can't move your head too much, can you? And that a lot of people in the industry. I mean, it didn't have a massive audience because not a lot of people working in the industry. A lot of people in the industry listened, but it wasn't about the technology. It was more about the economics, and it was an interesting time. Because it was the time when they're rolling out the broadband national broadband network in Australia, and it largely the conversation was about competition theory, really, and it was about cost subsidization and because the government was trying to roll out its own purpose-built network against an incumbent, and then they tried to change the government. They tried to sort of roll back on that a little bit. So then you had this hybrid situation where the government was saying, well, we're going to build it, but we'll allow other people in, but then you're going to have to pay a cost subsidy because we're paying to support the bush. And so that got into all sorts of interesting discussions about, well, what should you allow for open competition and what should the government do centrally? And actually, there's an example. Steve and I don't exactly see eye to eye on that, because I look at the national broadband network in Australia, which is a disaster, because what they've ended up with is the government has built a network, and it's because there's been a change of government, so there's been a change of strategy, but they've ended up with a mediocre broadband in Australia, which is actually very expensive. And they did freeze out a lot of investment by the rest of the industry, because the industry's going, well, the government's paying for all of this. There's no room for us to get in. And when they did say you can get in, they were saying, if you do invest in this area, you start selling services to customers, we're going to tax you the cross-subsidization fee for people who live in regional Australia, rather than the government just saying, well, we can cross-subsidize, people living in regional Australia, or, let's give it open competition, and we'll give you sort of like a token or something, so you can buy from whoever provides for your area. So there's that. So that whole so that's actually what probably got me most interested in economics, was actually looking at the economics about how public infrastructure projects like that are delivered. And then I've just read feverishly since I started talking to Steve. But there's no right answers in a lot of this as well, is there? That's why there's so much room for discussion, because there's no total right and wrong.
Yeah, let's tease that out a little bit more, Phil, because I remember one particular episode. I think it was talking about infrastructure related to a train system, and I don't know whether it was in England or where it was, but I think that was an example that in your podcast you guys talk about a nice mixture between private and public enterprise.
Yeah.
Does that ring a bell at all? And I want to actually, let's ask Steve first. Would you say that how you differ from Phil is that in a policy or in a policy move or a state-sponsored spending initiative? Would you say that that's necessary? Or when is that necessary?
I mean, we like the thing over the national broadband. We're both very similar, actually. We're differing over whether we differ here, Phil, because what was the stuff up was that the initial proposal was to build a broadband network with fiber to the house. So you'd actually everybody have an optical fiber connection over the whole country. That was the intention. Yeah. And the government was going to roll it out. And it was actually being done as part of the rescue for the global financial crisis. So as well as restarting the housing bubble and building lots of school halls and putting insulation in roofs, which are three of the programs the government did to stimulate the economy during the beginning of the crisis in 2008. They also were going to roll out a national broadband. Everybody gets a fiber optic connection. And what then happened was two extremely intelligent, very well-informed, what else can I say about them? It's total bullshit. Know what they're doing. Politicians, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull. There was a political change from Labor to Liberal, and they said we're going to make it much cheaper. So we're not going to have fiber to the house. We're going to have fiber to the node, and then copper from the fiber to the house, and that was just a total catastrophe. Which is
what exists in many parts of the world now, which has happened by default without any government investment, because it's just the incumbents sort of sweating the asset of the copper in the ground. How can we make it a bit faster? We'll just take the fiber a bit, to the cabinet in the street rather than all the way.
And that's one reason to have a government do the whole thing, not actually laying the cable itself, but pay for the whole thing, because you will cover the extra expense. It's like it's like having decent roads. You have decent roads almost to the house, and then to get to your house, you've got to walk through a paddock. I'm sorry.
But the issue was, I think that, and the reason why it went this way was because there was an element of Kevin Rudd. So what actually happened was Telstra was the incumbent. And they already had, the copper network. They owned they were the monopoly provider, and they weren't owned by the government, but they had, they'd been privatized, but basically privatized and sold off, so that they, but as holus bolus, so they had the wholesale and retail network, so they could do what they wanted with it, really. But people could compete with them if they wanted, and everywhere else in the world, basically at that time. It was just, what was called DSL. So it was just a connection from the exchange right to your house over copper all the way. And so it was hideously slow. Remember when broadband started, and you used to get, 512 kilobits per second was considered fast in those days. And that was ADSL. And then they started to, and so Telstra was asked or volunteered that they would start to roll out fiber to the cabinet. So you'd get much faster speeds, because the duration of the copper would be less, so the distance of the copper would be less. But Telstra said, but if we do that, if we roll that out, we want a holiday period, so like a monopoly holiday. So when we roll it out, we want to have whatever it is, even if it was only 2 years, where we are the only people who can sell those higher speeds. To our retail customers, so all the wholesale customers wouldn't get access to it. So quite rightly, the government said, no way, sod off. Telstra, and I've forgotten his name, he was Mexican, who was running Telstra.
That was when Kevin Rudd was still in charge, and when the guy was leaving, he said, adios.
Yeah, adios, amigo. But he
Steve, was. I'm questioning though about how the politicians dropped the ball, because I heard that in the beginning part of this.
Very badly.
But in that instance, where we're suddenly making a claim that the state-sponsored end-to-end, cradle-to-grave sort of product installation of the internet should be done through the state, then describe that again, and why that failed. Was that corruption? Was it just ignorance? Was it?
Can I just, sorry, because I was making the point too slowly, probably. But the point was, because the government had said, oh, well, we're not going to play ball with you. They said, that's the point at which they said, we are going to create our own network. And my problem with that was that you had an incumbent that already had a large number of constituent parts of that network. And they said, we're going to build it alongside what you've got. So in other words, we are going to supersede all the assets that you've got, even though some of those assets would be useful in that rollout. So that was my problem with, which I don't think Steve had a problem with. That was my problem with the way they started. They were basically saying, we're going to build something brand spanking new, whereas, you know, maybe you've got 40% of it, which is currently in existence. It's just unfortunately not owned by the government. It's owned by a private enterprise that doesn't want to play ball. So that was why it got off to a bad start.
And so let me clarify that. That you're saying you're fine with the government stepping in and taking over the project, but what rubbed you the wrong way was the infrastructure or the assets weren't being used by the government when they could, right? Is that what you're saying? Okay.
Yeah.
So reasonably, you could understand that moving the assets over, implementing the assets has a whole plethora of complexity to it, plus the possibility of legal implications. So you're aware of that a policymaker would say, you know, I don't want to be sucked down a rabbit hole of 10 to 20 years of litigation, or, you know, just a messy hornet's nest of transferring assets. So, I mean, could you give the politician the benefit of the doubt that, you know, this was just a judgment call to say, based off of efficiency and rolling out the plan, that we won't take advantage of those old assets?
I mean, they still did use some of the assets because they didn't want to dig holes in the ground, and actually that was a minefield in itself because they used the Telstra conduits, which a lot of them had asbestos in them, so that became this massive expense that they didn't know that they were going to face. I think my problem with it in the end, however they arrived at it, maybe we can break. I mean, it is an interesting discussion, the whole experience, but in the end, it did stop anybody. And I was reporting in this area. I knew the industry very well. I knew a lot of people who were quite innovative people who had their plans stymied because there was no ability to build any competing network. So, and if you did provide a competing network, ultimately, I mean, at the beginning they said no one can provide access. We're doing it. Then they thought that, well, maybe that might be a bit anti-competitive, so they allowed people to start doing it. But then they started saying, but if you're doing that, you've got to pay us because we're providing it in other areas. You've got to pay the cost subsidy. So and that's not competitive. To me, it makes sense in a contestable area where you've got a dense population. I don't see any problem in having more open slather competition in an innovative industry like telecommunications. Steve might disagree with me on that, but I mean, I look at in the UK, for example, where you've got multiple fiber providers. I mean, there's one big one, but in my town now, there's a startup that is rolling out fiber because they think Openreach isn't rolling out fiber fast enough. I don't see any problem with that. You know, we've got Virgin Media as well, so there's multiple ways you can get faster broadband, whereas Australia's stuck with one, and it's not very fast. And maybe it was done in the wrong way, but I do feel as though if at the beginning there had been more of an understanding of, allowing infrastructure competition. And I've changed my view on that. At the very beginning, I was thinking, you can't have infrastructure competition because you wouldn't want two sets of, pipes supplying water into your house. But that's very different. Actually, wiring up a house is a lot easier than, putting plumbing in. So I don't necessarily, and there's other ways you can provide access as well, such as Wi-Fi. Putting Wi-Fi access points just outside your house. Fibering up to the lamppost, for example, and giving you Wi-Fi because most people are just using Wi-Fi in the house anyway. So why have it hardwired right into your house? Why go that last half a meter or 2 meters, depending how big your house is or how your front garden is? Why not just have a Wi-Fi on the street outside? And then everyone can benefit from that. So there's alternate technologies as well. And I think this is an example where if the government tries to do too much themselves, there's a danger that they will implement a technology, even though everyone was saying fiber is future proof. There are alternatives as well, which they might have ignored. And the competition, lack of competition, I think would make it more expensive ultimately. So, yeah. Not exactly eye to eye on that, are we, Steve?
So we'll kind of switch gears here because I promised one of our regular viewers that we would answer her question. I actually talked to her last week, but Steve wasn't here. So I'm going to throw it up. We're going to kind of switch gears here. We'll have Jennifer. For the sake of the environment, shouldn't we discourage government deficit spending, especially during recessions, to contract the money supply and reduce GDP? Steve, I kind of answered that myself last week, but I'm more interested in a solid economist's view on this.
Well, I think when we start being forced into degrowth, there's two ways you can do degrowth. Okay, you can do it when you plan it, and you can do it when you don't plan it. Okay, there's 100% guarantee one of those two is in our future, because whatever we do, we're going to be forced to reduce our load on the planet by the biosphere itself. Now, in that situation, I can't see the private financial sector being feasible, frankly, in the main, except for transfers and shopping sort of thing. But in terms of private banks making a profit out of creating money, I think it's going to be impossible. So you're going to need, in that case, it's going to be 100% government money, which is something I've never advocated. I've always been aware of I've wanted to have a role for private sector money creation as well as government money creation. But I simply can't see the private system surviving, particularly with the levels of debt that corporations and households are carrying right now. If GDP collapses, there's no way they can finance their existing debt. GDP will collapse, therefore they can't finance their existing debt. So you're going to be reliant 100% on government money creation. And it isn't so much like the government money creation at the moment is if you tried to take over everything we do right now, then you'd be providing money which would take the place of private sector loans for investment, private sector loans for speculation, and so on. That's not going to happen. But we're going to need money. We're going to need money turnover, and I see that coming completely out of the government spending, because it just won't be profitable. Capitalism, as I've said, capitalism is going to be destroyed by neoclassical economists because they encourage us to overshoot the planet's boundaries so totally that we'll be forced to go into reverse, and we go into reverse, capitalism won't work.
But when banks, sorry, I'm falling in. Yeah. Sorry, guys, I'm falling into my natural tendency here.
Go right for it. Yeah.
But I raised my hand too. I got something that I got to say.
So when banks create money, though, I mean, 9 times out of 10, it's to give a loan to somebody so they can get a house, and it pushes up the asset of that house. And then, and like everybody, I'm over in debt to the bank, which means I'm actually not spending very much money on anything else. So actually that's good for the planet, because I can't afford to buy stuff which might be destructive for the planet. I'm too busy paying the bank for the housing loan I've got.
Yeah. Forced austerity there, right? That's very, that is very interesting perspective, Phil.
Yeah. So banks, thank God for the banks doing that to us.
I love that. So back to Steve there for a minute. Something that I'm clearly on your side from my perspective, but I do interchange and exchange, have conversations with people on the other side that have more conservative views, we'll say. Okay, and I want to let's do a scenario where you say you're absolutely right. Your prediction of economic and GDP collapse will happen. We have a crystal ball. It will happen. The issue is, what if it happens in 250 years? What if it happens? Because there seems to be an ongoing perception of time bias, right? We all know that we discount inappropriately, on future events, right? So what I find is that as we progress through the pandemic, as we continue to have these conversations, what I'm hearing back in sentiment is, see, it's not collapsing. There's no issue. We still got growth. I
think it's my analogy there is we're still doing a fantastic speed here. We're still accelerating. What's you saying about us hitting a brick wall? Okay, so I think we're going to hit a brick wall climate-wise in not 250 years. I think we're lucky it'll be 25, more likely less than that. And then when that happens, it doesn't matter what we plan to do. It's what the climate will enable us, permit us to do, that'll be feasible level of production. So I can see a total plunge. And in that situation, everything we're used to, the price system, private money creation, et cetera, will die, in the sense that there's no way you could sell stuff for a profit. There'll be entire industries that have to disappear. Some will have a bit of growth. I think the glass industry is going to do very well. Plastics very badly, for example, in terms of no more plastic wrapping, but maybe we're saving glass containers for everything when we go shopping. But I just think it's going to fall apart in a heap, and in that heap, the private money system won't function. So it's going to be government money creation. Yeah. So that's my very pessimistic. I admit it's pessimistic, but I'm having read what I've read on neoclassical. The only way that I can be wrong is if neoclassical economists' assumptions are right.
I would not say pessimistic. There's some famous studies by a philosopher by the name of Arthur Schopenhauer, and it to me resonates an attitude, kind of like, you glass half full, half empty sort of thing. And I think that the meat of what you're actually saying is based on empirical studies, right? I mean,
very much so.
So this is, you derive your opinion, you build it from a foundation of empirical reality, and then you say, well, here's what I derive from that, right? Is that?
Yeah. It's empirical projection, because I'm looking at, the enormous literature on climate change in the actual original papers. I'm not going through the IPCC, I'm reading the papers themselves. And I see some horror stories there, real horror stories. And I think, holy shit, if other people saw these horror stories, then they would be totally, paranoid about the potential, what we're going to strike. And we could be, the scariest ones I've seen would be striking in the next between 5 and 25 years. It's not 250.
So where does it hit first? Because imagine if, I don't know, the impact of the climate affects us in some way. The natural response, I mean, I don't know what it does. It makes, it means something needs to be built. More walls need to be built to stop the sea, or we need more investment in renewables or whatever. It's going to be, an industry is going to emerge in making us live with this new climate, isn't it? There's going to be demand for something, whatever it might be, to help us make it through. And that is going to come from,
well, for example, one really big industry, suntan lotion. Okay, we could have a real market in suntan lotion. The reason being, the scariest.
Buy shares now, folks.
Yeah, actually, buy shares in suntan lotion. And rather than stocking up on toilet paper, stock up on suntan lotion. Because if James Anderson from the Harvard University chemistry department is correct, we're going to destroy the ozone layer. Okay.
So there's an example. There'll be other things as well where, the economy changes, but there's still money being made. So I don't understand quite talk through how that all breaks down. If we are having to adapt our life to cope with a changing climate, and okay, we realize in that process we need zero growth, but zero growth doesn't mean we're going totally backwards. It just means we're not reliant on that growth, which obviously capitalism is dependent on. Just trying to see what hits first. What's the first thing? What's the first change?
That's the problem. We simply don't know. Nobody's done this before on this planet. We haven't found anything in the geological record to show any other intelligent species, wiped itself out by picking up buried sunshine from 100 million years beforehand and burning the whole lot in 200 years. That's what we're doing. So we don't know. But that's why what I want to establish, if I can, is a wargaming center with the military heavily involved, where we wargame, if this is how climate change first destroys our productive capability, what do we do? So one of the potentials, and this comes out, if we have a collapse in the AMOC, which is the huge ocean conveyor belt that conveys heat to the northern hemisphere. Oh, come on, Stephen, you don't know what you're talking about. Yes, I'm happy to say goodbye to you if you believe it's a scam. Stephen Hoffman. Bye, Stephen. That if we get a famine,
he's gone to buy his shares in suntan lotion. That's where he's gone.
That's good. Yeah. No, I don't think so. Okay, but if we lose it through a global famine, then you've got to have what's your response for a global famine. If it's ozone layer being destroyed, then what's your response for that? If it's huge storms, with the ones that James Hansen is predicting, so 40 meter storms on the Atlantic, then that's basically going to say goodbye to shipping. So what do you do in that situation? Do I want a war game? What our response has to be.
Okay, that makes sense. But why do you see that the private sector almost disappears and everything falls into government money creation?
The private sector will still continue until there will be private factories, the ones that aren't destroyed by whatever comes from the climate, and private innovation as well. And the same thing happened in the Second World War. It wasn't the government that made the Sherman tank. Okay, the Sherman government paid. I don't know who made the Sherman tank. I wish I knew the name of the manufacturer. Probably Ford. But Ford or General Motors. So the private company made it with money provided by the government, where the money was deficit funded, and that's the world I expect we're going to have.
But that was because you don't go into war to make a profit. But I mean, if we're going into a situation where the climate is changing, and let's hope it doesn't change quite as quickly or suddenly as you're predicting, but we go through a series of decades where we start to see the climate is changing significantly, then private enterprise is going to go, there's an opportunity here for us to make money doing whatever it is to counter the impacts of climate.
There'll be private enterprise, but it'll be a government directed system the same way it was in World War II. And there'll be rationing to say,
but I think before that, I'm just questioning whether before that, even without the government directive.
This is really interesting, Phil. So you and Steve, like Steve is pushing more of a collapse, and Phil, you're discussing an easing into and private enterprise adapting to it. Even in a degrowth economy, that is quite possible. I would sit somewhere in the middle. I would sit somewhere in the middle, because there's going to be instances around the world. I just don't think that we will get our shit together on a global scale. So I want to take Ukraine as an example. There's probably an epicenter of like a radius outside of Ukraine that is affected by Ukraine economically. And we know that in Europe, as opposed to, say, I don't know what the effect is in Australia. I don't know what it really is in Canada. I don't know if I was to isolate what the effect of the Ukraine, Russia conflict and war is on the Canadian economy. I don't know how I would do that. But to bring this into the comparison between what Phil's position is and what your position is, it seems to me like there will be nationalistic or populations that will still thrive in a Phil-inspired, capitalistic, opportunity-driven market, right? And then there's other areas or like locations around the world that will be absolutely devastated. Okay, and would you guys see that as, I'm not trying to negotiate history, but in terms of like a reality of the way things are going to unfold, would you say that is a more realistic way that things will progress?
It's not going to be one size fits all, and it's going to be. And we've got distracted from the question itself, which is really about the monetary system. So my answer to that question is, government monetary system will become far more prominent when this begins. The private sector will be much more subsidiary role, which is similar to what happened in World War II as well. So that's my overall answer to that particular question.
But my point on that was why would bank money creation stop? So I gave the example about, people are still going to want mortgages for houses, which is where most of that money is coming from.
No, but wait a minute. I want to ask that question again. Do you guys understand the question? That is it. That you got Phil with one perspective, and you've got Steve with a collapse perspective. So the pockets of variation around the world. Do you see that is a logical way that it would unfold?
No, it'll be dramatically varied around the planet, but if you have let's say the whole agricultural sector of the Middle Western United States gets wiped out. So there's nobody gets the crop disappears. Nobody can pay their mortgages. The banks then go bankrupt, etc., etc. It's a situation where the government, just like in the Second World War, the government's going to be the dominant factor in the economy, bar none, and the private sector will dance to their tune. So it's not capitalism anymore.
Mm.
So we've seen on the interesting what Brexit has done in the UK. So rhubarb used to be just so cheap. Why would people eat rhubarb? Because it's cheap. That's the only reason you'd eat rhubarb. And even when you if you've got to mix it with apples for it to be palatable, there's no such thing as a rhubarb crumble. There's a rhubarb and apple crumble, because the apple.
Wait, those are fighting words. Those are fighting words. Phil, those are fighting words. My grandma. Come on, rhubarb pie. Put a little strawberry in there. I know you have to mix that, but
anyway, so rhubarb used to be very cheap. Now, rhubarb in Britain, which grows, because I think rhubarb likes cold, moist climates, doesn't it? So, I mean, Britain should be self-sufficient. If you'd be thinking, if push comes to shove and everything else goes to shit, we could just all eat rhubarb in Britain. You'd think that would be, that would be our saving grace. But rhubarb now, basically, one stalk of rhubarb is £1. So you get 3 for £3, which is what in the supermarkets, if you're lucky enough to get them, and there's a real shortage of it. And I think that is because there's not enough people to pick it. And so whereas I can get a watermelon from Brazil for £2. So which is a heavy thing to transport around the world. So it's actually cheaper to get something grown in South America, shipped around the world, than it is to get something which is made locally. So that's the craziness of it all. And I think, so in Britain, here we are faced with the fact there's not enough people picking up agriculture, and so we are, and supplies in supermarkets, definitely there's less choice than there was before Brexit and before COVID. So we're starting to see it's not climate change that's doing that. It's actually just the lack of imported labor to be able to pick stuff in fields in the UK. So we're already suffering the agricultural consequences of something. So maybe climate change will give us more of a taste of that. But Britain's getting in there early with our rhubarb shortages, which is depending on your perspective, is not necessarily a bad thing.
If you don't like rhubarb. Let's move the conversation along here. I'm trying to fit as many topics as we can. Well, we have Phil. I'm going to let Steve kind of go off here. I try to rein him in. No, we're gonna get to some neoclassical and new Keynesian talk here. So I have a question, and I think it's worth addressing. After all the exposure of loanable funds theory and the fallacies, why do new Keynesians insist on relying on it? Steve, what's your opinion on that?
Because if they neoclassical economics is like a very intricate Fabergé egg, and if you touch it in the wrong spot, it falls apart. And the problem is every spot is the wrong spot. So if you acknowledge that the supply curve slope, the marginal cost falls rather than rises, bang, the theory disappears. If you acknowledge that banks create money, bang, the theory disappears. So there's huge elements of reality they can't allow to be incorporated in their theory without fracturing everything else in the system. So part of their argument is that money is a veil over barter. And if you have the loanable funds model, then fundamentally the distribution of money doesn't matter. It's all the real dynamics that change. But if you bring in the fact that banks create money, then credit becomes part of aggregate demand, and your entire model falls apart. So that that was the problem. They simply can't acknowledge these elements of reality, and loanable funds is the most exposed one that they've got. Acknowledging that firms don't have rising marginal costs to throw the theory out, acknowledging that there's no such thing as the marginal product doesn't determine incomes, etc., etc. So this is just the most prominent example of where they can't admit reality into their modeling framework, and they'll therefore defend their modeling framework no matter what.
All right, so I want to throw something up, and Phil, I want you to take a stab at it first, and then Steve, can you jump in as well here? So, this is, I'm not sure that the central government can manage an economy under a constant negative growth forces and with interest and inflation bound money. We're in a situation of mass disruption and constant destruction. So, how would you think about that and reason through that one there, Phil?
Well, let's just take the first part of that and ignore the rest of the sentence. I'm not sure the central government can manage an economy. I mean, that's the that's the, whenever you're reliant on governments going it alone without any private sector influence to sort of keep them honest, you have a bunch of politicians trying to centrally plan, and then we're back to Soviet Russia, and that's it. We know that doesn't work. So, and this is whenever we get into this discussion, when if you start looking at governments having more involvement through modern monetary theory, for example, or any reliance on the government sector to do more, I think is dangerous, because they have shown time and time again they're not very good at doing stuff. And so if the future Steve's describing is that governments really almost need to take control to cope with climate change, then frankly we're buggered, because they'll stuff it up.
I think we are buggered. I think we are buggered on that front too, because the level of incompetence in government has gotten worse under neoliberalism. I mean, if you go back to the days of Nugget Coombs in the Second World War, then you had quite a competent bureaucracy that was built up during the Second World War itself and during the Great Depression, and that's been systematically dismantled under the whole neoliberal thing. So we've now got a bunch of incompetent neoclassical economists telling the government what to do, and it's going to be dysfunctional. So. And COVID showed that on a dramatic scale. The dysfunctionality of our response on COVID is just ridiculous. And so I think we won't do any better in climate change. It's a question of when people have realized how serious things are, then maybe our capacity to manage will improve somewhat when they take it truly seriously. But I've got no great faith in their capacity to do it properly.
Probably not. That's why I advocate for a social military intervention. So an intervention at a military scale, but changing the role of military. One thing that military science is, but I realize what kind of a adjuncta implication that may result from that. I realize what I'm saying, right? Like I realize what that implies. Yeah. However, the science behind military, the engineering behind military, this is the forefront of our ability as a human species to organize, to build roads, to handle logistics, to implement engineering. This is the mechanism. This is the most efficient mechanism that we have for that. So the future that I imagine in the catastrophe scenario that Steve brings up is to say that that's the kind of, the planning goes into that, making that military complex more accountable to the public and taking some of the traditions from a free market economy into something that serves the people more. But you get this like interaction with the military, right? I don't know if it's possible. Like Steve said, it's never been done before.
Yeah. But the military, I agree, is going to have a much larger role.
So Conrad commented just there. Well, it's like the Roman army. Just going back a couple of thousand years. That's all. But it's. I mean, we certainly do. Whenever we're in trouble, we always call in the army, don't we? The binmen are on strike, we call the army. It's like we rely on them to get us out of trouble, and that's because they do it efficiently. So I take your point, and that there's a training there, isn't there? A single-mindedness, perhaps, which gets stuff done.
I love the idea of the Roman. situation. I've thought of that many times, and think about a middle class, upper class Roman family, and asking them to prepare for the eventual downfall of Rome. How do they even wrap their heads around the infrastructure and the lifestyle and the culture? They have to almost give up that identity, realizing that that the Goths are coming, right? Like and I've drawn parallels to people understanding what they have to give up in terms of our luxuries and the entitlement around flying around the world for weekend visits, or Vegas for a weekend kind of stuff, right? Like, how do this is it, but in American sense, this is their right to do this.
If we're dealing with climate change, then we're saying, well, what can we learn from the Romans about what have the Romans ever taught us about climate change? I mean, the problem was, of course, that we've got geographic boundaries. So whatever we do is got to be done with a whole load of countries. The Romans got over that problem by invading, of course, but we can't do that. So we've got, how do you develop a cohesive solution, even if you say, well, we'll get the army involved? Does every country do that? And then you get armies fighting armies over something that no one can quite agree on the way forward. So once again, we're stuffed. You can just hope Steve's wrong. That's the other alternative. You just have to hope Steve's wrong on his timing.
I'd be delighted to be wrong. Truly delighted.
But let's assess. Really ask: is there a way that you can self-assess the reasons why or how you could be wrong? From a scientific and academic standpoint, I mean,
if global warming is a scam, I'm wrong. Okay.
Well, we can throw that out. I hope it's a scam.
I hope it's a scam. Pity is I know a bit too much about mathematics to take that seriously.
That's the point. So, is there a middle ground? Is there where are your blind spots? Do you know? I mean, they wouldn't be blind if you couldn't.
I think the question for society is: are we going through now a period of mitigation because we think prevention is? We're not going to prevent it, and so is it just a case of mitigation? And if it's a case of mitigation, then we're saying, well, okay, how do we live in an environment where food is more scarce and we're going to see the population declining? And should that then be left just to government, or is there an opportunity for the private sector to say, well, okay, we'll get in here and first of all, we need to make food production more efficient somehow. I don't know how that's done. And we need to cool people down if they're too hot. We maybe need to move people from areas where it's uninhabitable. There's all of that, which is on a global scale is not going to be done by individual companies coordinating amongst themselves, because we know that's not very good either. So I still feel as though that's only going to happen, that mitigation exercise, by people making money out of it.
Yeah. Well, that's the one way I could be wrong too in terms of mitigation. If we mitigate and we can convert rapidly enough, I mean, we don't actually trigger tripping points, etc., then we avoid by fancy footwork. And my opinion of humans' capacity for fancy footwork is, I'm sorry, doing 50 years ago possible, not now.
Yeah.
So sorry, Dan. Steve, let's before we run out of time, what's your opinion on peak oil these days?
Oh, I've said we're past the peak of normal oil. This has actually brings up the whole innovation point as well, because the actual supplies of normal oil peaked globally maybe 5 years ago, maybe 10 years ago, and American oil peaked in the 1980s. So we in terms of the conventional oil, we've already peaked. What's come in instead, of course, is fracking, which is then releasing oil from shale, and that is dramatically. That meant that we're continuing being able to produce oil by adding fracking to the equation, and but that itself has its own limitations. So I think we're definitely experiencing peak oil. But the question is that what's going to trip us up? Because the old saying, the Stone Age didn't end because of a lack of stones. It's the fact that some technology comes along that makes it feasible to replace stones with something else, let's say copper or iron. Now, could we face the same thing here? Could we electric cars, etc., to come along to the point that we no longer use oil. Now, physically speaking, I don't think that's the case. I think we are going to start finding ourselves running out of oil as a fuel for, the vehicle, predominantly the use for fuel, rather for transport rather than anything else. Coal, on the other hand, we have enough now for 300 years, and that's 300 years of growth at the current rate of growth. We'll never run out of coal. We're not going to have peak coal, but I think we've already had peak oil. We've managed to avoid it by technological development in fracking, but that itself, I think fracking, from what I've seen, a fracked well loses 40% of its output per year. Once it starts at a very high peak, it drops off very, very rapidly. So the capacity to continue using fracking as a source, I think, is quite limited. And of course, fracking and things like tar sands and so on, a dramatic increase in the pollution levels, which are already the problem with oil itself. So I think that the point of peak oil was accurate. The technological development of an alternative way of getting oil out of the ground, the fracking technology, that wasn't taken into account by King. Is it King Hubert King?
Hubert King.
Oh, King Hubert, actually, because actually reverse. I think it's King Hubert's
yeah.
Yeah. So he was correct. Okay, but then people are, well, the technology managed to get us out of it, but the technology amplified the problem with oil, which is too much carbon dioxide.
So, Phil, it's a provocative topic. Peak oil, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that the alternatives, even though clearly we've passed peak oil, and it's getting more expensive now to get oil, and so that means prices will continue to rise. So hopefully that makes it more commercially viable for us to use alternatives. I mean, fracking is just and this is an area where there has to be government involvement, doesn't it? I mean, fracking is just a nonsense, isn't it? So bad for the environment, and it's expensive. So, I think the government does need to get involved in trying to, produce regulation and influence pricing. But we have to, we all know, it's no surprise that we all know. I mean, I think even, diehard neoliberals would say that we need to move on in terms of the energy mix that we've got, and we need to, combination of subsidies and regulation, shift towards using alternative technologies. But we also need to use less, and I think that's possible as well, isn't it? And part of that might be less travel, more staying at home. I feel like there's a lot of that going on now. We don't travel as much as we used to before COVID. I live just outside London, and people were going into London every day and hated it, and now they're working from home and would rather work from home and going to London once a week in many cases. So traveling less, consuming less, I think is all doable without it necessarily. I mean, I think this idea that consuming less means a reduction in our standard of living is wrong. I think we just need to define what our standard of living is, and sometimes actually consuming less might actually improve our standard of living. So we will need less oil and less energy generally. But I mean, obviously we've got to look for alternatives, don't we?
Yeah. I think you hit it on the head. It's about adjusting how we perceive our standard of living. I think that's the biggest challenge versus some physical standard of living.
Well, do you know what? Sorry to interrupt, Ty, but do you, I don't know if it's the same for you, but during COVID, that first month of COVID, so it was March a few years ago, and Britain actually had an unseasonably warm March. The roads were empty. Everyone was cycling everywhere, and people were sort of embarrassed to admit, I quite like pandemics. It means the roads. I don't have to go into work. People were still working, but working from home, and they were enjoying getting out and enjoying the great outdoors. And people would be talking over the street. People would be talking to each other because they didn't want to get too close to each other. But you had that sense of community came back again. Now we're back. The roads are busy. People haven't got time to go for walks. They're not enjoying the great outdoors as much as they were. But if you ask people, how was it that first month, or even that first year, and people were saying it was terrific. So why have we gone back away from that when we enjoyed it so much? Why don't we just consume less and enjoy the planet rather than destroy the planet?
Yep. I'm 100% with you, Phil. I really am. I mean, I think, Steve, we talked about this when we did the COVID and climate correlations podcast or video series. I mean, you can scale way back. Like, I think that it came in the context of the carbon credit or issuing something on a government level. And Steve brought up the point that the average person wouldn't be hit as hard as the people at the end of the wealth distribution, right? People with the wealthiest. And so would there still be opulence in the world? Yeah, it just would cost a whole bunch more of a fat tail, right? The ultra rich would have to spend so much more of their money. Do you remember that conversation a long time ago about Michael Jordan losing $1 million in Vegas or something like that? There was this big deal about, wow, that means nothing. That is nothing. That's me going into Vegas and dropping $10 on the floor. That's what that means, right? So if he's going to go into Vegas, well, in his Michael Jordan, he's probably going to spend $1 million because he's got lots of them.
Yeah. At that end of the spectrum, that has to spend less. That's the part. That's going to be the fun part, because when you look at when ancient civilizations have collapsed, you quite frequently find that there's a revolt by the lower class against the ruling class, because it's the ruling class that locks you into a trend which is unsustainable. And then when it becomes unsustainable, the human sacrifices don't stop the food supplies collapsing, then you find that the people who are starting to starve go along and raid the compounds of the wealthy, and that was like Teotihuacan was like that. I think even what's it called, Petra, elements of that. So the revenge of the working class when the system breaks down. Let's see what happens this time. We're going to find out.
We're going to end on another Steve Keen catastrophe.
I'm sorry about that. I hate doing it. I'm an optimistic bastard. Just a neoclassical economist running the world rather than me, and that's why it's stuffed up.
All right. Okay. Well, that's it. Hopefully Ty can come back here. If not, I'm going to close out the show.
Oh no.
He's never going to let you do that.
We're not done. We want to. We're not done.
Okay.
We want to make sure to thank all the people in the chat. There was another good conversation going on the side. Even on a Super Bowl weekend, you decided to join in, and we appreciate that, and we love you for it. Make sure you hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe. If you're watching on Twitter right now, make sure you retweet this live stream and hit the little like button on there. We will see you again next week with another guest. We're going to have Phil back again because he's good. I almost want him to come run the show. He is. Yeah. He is a natural.
It's all yours.
He is a natural. I saw it coming out during the hour. He was right into that interviewer mode, and I liked it a lot. So we appreciate you coming on, Phil.
No worries.
Until next, for sure. Until next week, we have Steve Keen, we have Daniel Sanderson, and we have Phil Dobbie and Ty Keynes. See you later. And we did it again. Now, as I said, our last show was canceled after you appeared on it, so fingers crossed the executives don't do that again.
The more I read in the neoclassical thing, the more I just, I'm scratching my eyeballs out all the time.
The voice of God in the background.
Oh, geez. Once the coins get warm enough because of your body temperature in the winter, it actually keeps you moderate beer drinking in the evenings. Well, that's inspiring for a Saturday morning.